Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to ask a question. In terms of fiction and storytelling, what is fantasy? Well, there's uppercase fantasy, which usually refers to a genre of fiction that takes place in a fantasy world. The genre is dominated by creative derivatives of the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, creator of the Middle-earth books, Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Cimmerian, and C.S. Lewis, creator of the Chronicles of Narnia. It's a genre that has since moved into TV, movies, and games. That's not the kind of fantasy I'm going to be talking about here, however. I'm talking about lowercase fantasy. This kind of fantasy is far more general and isn't talked about as much these days. Lowercase fantasy can best be described as something that isn't real. In the most general of terms, any piece of fiction is a piece of fantasy, but that's going a little too far. For this discussion, I'm talking about stories that generally can't or don't happen in our real world. The best example I can think of when it comes to a body of work that is lowercase fantasy is the original Twilight Zone series. Rod Serling, the show's creator, called it a fantasy show, but keep in mind that the genre we today think of as uppercase fantasy was still in its infancy, as the Tolkien Lord of the Rings books were published a mere 5 years prior to the first episode of The Twilight Zone airing. The Twilight Zone can largely be summed up, perhaps reductively, as a show about weird shit happening to ordinary people. Not all of the shows are about ordinary people, of course, but most of them are. Episodes like Dingle the Strong, To Serve Man, and A Most Unusual Camera all feature ordinary people dealing with, or encountering, or experiencing a narrative fantasy element, being either supernatural or science fiction in nature. Since uppercase fantasy has become its own genre, writers like Harlan Ellison had and have sought to rebrand lowercase fantasy as speculative fiction, but so far that hasn't quite caught on yet. Most people don't know what you're talking about when you mention speculative fiction. The reason why I'm making these distinctions will make more sense later on. Now we come to the actual subject of today's video. It's a relatively obscure film from 1987 called Hiding Out, starring Jon Cryer. This film was originally billed in advertising as Jon Cryer is Hiding Out. If you saw the film overseas, it may have been titled Incognito. While today's audiences know Jon Cryer best from starring with Ashton Kutcher and Charlie Sheen in the sitcom 2.5 Men, what many today may not know is that back in the 1980s, Jon Cryer was loosely associated with a group of young actors collectively referred to as the Brat Pack, having starred in a John Hughes-penned teen drama called Pretty in Pink. Back then, Cryer was featured on the covers of magazines like Tiger Beat, as he was, albeit briefly, a teen heartthrob. The film begins with Cryer playing a big city stockbroker named Andrew Morinsky, who, along with a couple of his colleagues, unwittingly pass bogus bonds for what turns out to be a local mobster who is awaiting trial. The FBI arrives to put them into protective custody, but a hitman hired by the mobster manages to kill Morinsky's colleagues. Morinsky manages to escape after the hitman kills the 2 FBI agents assigned to protect him, and he flees by stowing away on a departing train. He eventually makes his way to Delaware, where he plans to hide out with his extended family, his aunt, played by Cryer's real-life mother, Gretchen, and his cousin Patrick, played by Keith Coogan. He arrives in Topsail, Delaware, at a run-down, mom-and-pop-run convenience store where he decides to alter his appearance. Grabbing a t-shirt off of a rack, some scissors, and some styling products, Morinsky goes into the restroom. It is at this point that I want to pause, because here is where the film begins its signature turn, and this is the point where I believe the film begins to go from being a thriller comedy to a fantasy. When Morinsky emerges from the bathroom, he has transformed. When I watched this film with my mother years ago, she did not even recognize Cryer until he spoke. Morinsky trades his expensive Italian sports jacket for a bum's pea coat, complete with National Defense Medal, and proceeds to his aunt's workplace to make contact with her workplace being the local public high school where she works as a nurse. Morinsky arrives at the school and heads to the main office, where he is taken aback by how the school's faculty and staff speak to him and treat him. They do so as though he is a student there. Keep in mind that Morinsky has just been targeted for deletion and narrowly escaped his own murder just the day before. Both bemused and amused by the fact that everyone in this school seems to think he's a student there, he decides to play along, wanting to see how far he can get with this misunderstanding.
Includes all faculty, teachers.
Take a seat. It'll be a minute.
3, sit up. It's okay. I didn't call your parents yet.
No, I think you're making a real mistake.
And taking a blowtorch to the couch in the teacher's lounge, was that also perhaps a real mistake?
But
Young man, are you supposed to be in this office? Let me see your pass.
I don't have one. I'm new here.
First name first, last name last.
Maxwell.
Maxwell what?
Hauser.
Last school attended.
Cornell. High school. My records could take weeks.
Everything takes weeks.
Now, the rest of the film plays out just as one might expect. Cryer's character masquerades as a student at this high school for about 3 weeks, and manages to make enemies with some of the teachers as well as the formerly most popular guy in school, even challenging him for class president. Eventually, the hitman tracks Morinsky down and, thanks to all the Vote for Maxwell Hauser signs everywhere, figures out how and where Morinsky is hiding, but not before expressing frustration about not being able to find him. It's funny because the hitman doesn't notice at first that Morinsky's face is everywhere, and that he is, in fact, hiding in plain sight. The film does have its flaws, however. The biggest one being the character of Mrs. Billings, played by Nancy Fish. Billings is portrayed as a tyrannical teacher who is conservative and seeks to rewrite the history books when it comes to Richard Nixon. I can tell you that this idea is far more outlandish and harder to grasp than a 29-year-old passing himself off as a 19-year-old. Even in the 1980s, there were so few conservative public school teachers that you would be hard-pressed to find even one at any school. The ones that did exist were smart enough to not broadcast it the way Billings does, but that's Hollywood. Of course, the evil teacher is a Nixon apologist. It's just not in Hollywood's DNA, even back in the 80s, to more accurately characterize a tyrannical teacher as a statist leftist. There is also one aspect of this film that might make some of the more sensitive modern audiences a little concerned. You see, John Cryer's character dates and falls in love with a girl going to the high school named Ryan. Now, while they don't stoop, they do smooch, if you get what I'm saying. Yes, he's 10 years older than she is, but she is legal, so cool your jets. One of the funny little moments in the film is when Cryer is picking her up on a date and ends up giving valuable tax advice to her father, and he in turn shows his appreciation.
Right, just finishing up some paperwork, and this new tax code has got me all screwed up.
Oh yeah, tell me about it. So are you taking these standard deductions or are you itemizing? Well, but what about this loss here? You see, you can offset the dividend income there.
Wow, I missed that.
Yeah, it's like $1,000 right there.
Oh, listen, wait, Ryan, I want to treat you guys. Here's some cash.
Really?
Really?
As mentioned, the hitman eventually tracks him down and, with an accomplice, attempts the hit on Morinsky. Morinsky and the school's janitor, who Morinsky befriended earlier in the film, manage to take care of the two killers using their familiarity with the campus. The film ends with it now being fall, and we see Robin is now attending university. Cryer's character, now in the witness protection program, approaches her and introduces himself as Eddie Collins and says he is attending the same university where he is pursuing a teaching degree. Because, of course, he is. This movie works, I feel, because of John Cryer. He was 21 at the time this was filmed, and he was one of those actors, like Michael J. Fox, who could convincingly play a teenager well into his 20s. But the film actually hinges on his ability to convincingly play an older man at the start of the film. Then, when he slips into a variant of his Ducky character from Pretty in Pink, it's a nigh supernatural transformation. The best special effect in the film is Cryer himself. Something similar happened in the 1980s with actor Kelsey Grammer. Kelsey Grammer was able to play the Frasier Crane character for so many years because he started playing the character while he was in his mid-20s. His receding hairline and ability to portray a much older man also made the actor seem immortal, having played the character from 1984 to 2004. Now, would you consider this film, Hiding Out, to be a fantasy film? Most wouldn't, but I think an argument could be made for it being a fantasy story in a stealthy kind of way. You see, most people 10 years out of high school could not convincingly fool people into thinking they were teenagers. Usually there is a significant and noticeable weight gain that takes place during a person's 20s, for one thing. Hiding Out doesn't dwell on the strangeness that Marinsky has somehow reversed time and is now perceived as a high school student. It instead accepts this and runs with it. This story could have easily been steered even further into the fantasy realm were it told on, say, The Twilight Zone. I consider this to be a multi-genre piece, and if remade today, a director, producer, writer may want to emphasize the fantastic element that this film chooses to downplay and use only for comedic purposes. Another film that did this was Kevin Costner's Field of Dreams, a film that I remember a lot of adults saying they were confused by when it came out. When you mentioned this film around some of my relatives, they made noises of disgust and said they walked out of it in the theater. The reason was because the supernatural elements in the film were never fully explained, and in their minds they should have been. They didn't know that they were watching a fantasy film, you see. They didn't know they were watching a feature-length Twilight Zone episode. The film's trailers and movie posters made it seem like a quirky drama about Costner's character building a baseball diamond in his cornfield. Elements like the mysterious voice that tells him to do it, the long-dead ball players who emerge from the cornfield to play in the diamond, and the time travel elements aren't explained. The film simply rolls with it because the story isn't really about those things. Hiding Out was part of a movie trend in the 1980s called the Generation Squeeze. The idea was that they would attract young audiences to theaters with aggressive advertising campaigns on channels like MTV, while simultaneously having material to attract older audiences when the film comes out on home video, which is a burgeoning thing in the 1980s. The most successful Generation Squeeze film was probably Back to the Future, which my dad enjoyed even more than I did when we saw it in the theater in the summer of 1985. As mentioned, Hiding Out was heavily advertised in 1987 on MTV, with both trailers for the film being featured heavily in commercial break rotation, as well as the hit music video for the film, Catch Me I'm Falling by Pretty Poison, getting played heavily in the channel's video rotation. I made this video because I just happened to be thinking about Hiding Out the other day while I was writing. Speaking of fantasy, I do play around with the idea of someone being a kid again and going back to school in a short story contained in my book, Captain Steele and Other Stories. The short story is called Wesley, and if you're curious, feel free to buy a copy on Amazon. The link will be in the description. Thanks for watching.
Did you ever ask yourself, how did I get here? Who wants to kill you? Oh, this money guy who came to our company with a lot of bonds he wanted us to handle. Millions of dollars worth. Oh, come on. What do you think Capitos's gonna do? He's gonna kill us? He had us laundering money for the mob.
There's only one thing more frightening than murder. High school. John Cryer is hiding out.
You've left the outside world. You gotta orient your thinking. You gotta think repression, think limits, think humiliation and despair. You're in high school, for God's sake.
No smoking on the school grounds. First name first, last name last.
Oh, you want my name? Maxwell.
Andrew.
Max.
Right.
Sean?
You're the guy there looking for the newspaper from up there in Boston.
I used to be exactly like you. I was a short, hopeless dork.
But look at you now.
Well, I'm not short. I could look at her face the rest of my life.
The rest of your life may not add up to much, pal.
Well, I'm almost 30 and I'm still in high school. And I hate it. What is this stuff?
You don't want to know.
John Cryer
Last school attended. Cornell. High school.
is hiding out.